Her tavern's signature drink had a special burn that kept locals coming back. In 1890, in the hills of Tennessee, a widow named Eliza did something unimaginable. She distilled her dead husband into whiskey. But this wasn't a desperate attempt at keeping his memory alive. This was an act born from obsession, a dark tradition rooted in the South's most forbidden rituals. Grief drove her to madness. And in that madness, Eliza found herself crossing a line no one should ever cross. What happened next would shake the town to its core, and her story would become one of the darkest legends in Southern folklore. This is the chilling tale of the widow who distilled her husband. Eliza stood in the quiet of her cabin, staring at the empty space where Samuel had once stood. The scent of tobacco still lingered in the air, the smell of their life together. Samuel had been her world, and now he was gone, leaving her in a silence so deep it felt as if the earth itself had swallowed the sound of her heart. It was an impossible void, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't fill it. It wasn't just the loss of him, it was the loss of everything. Their plans, their future, their dreams together. Gone. The funeral had been a blur, a sea of faces all wearing that same pitiful expression, pretending to understand. "You're strong, Eliza," they said. But they didn't know. No one could know what it felt like to watch the person you love slip away from you, leaving only their empty clothes behind. Samuel had always been larger than lifeless laughter, his stories, his presence, and now there was nothing but his memory. Eliza tried to sleep, but when she closed her eyes, it was as though she could still hear him. It was the silence that drove her mad. She would wake up in the middle of the night drenched in sweat, as if she had been talking to him. Sometimes she swore she could hear his voice, just beyond the door, just outside the window. But every time she reached out, the silence would return, cold and unyielding. The first week after Samuel's death, Eliza had done what any widow might do. She mourned. She cried for hours, let the townspeople comfort her with hollow words, and tried to numb the pain by losing herself in their endless chatter. But as the days turned into weeks, the grief didn't subside. It became an obsession, a hunger, a gnawing desperation to hold on to something of Samuel. And so, she found herself walking to the old cabin where they had once made their moonshine together. The place smelled of aging wood and sweet earthy moonshine, a scent that used to comfort her. Now, it felt like a tomb. Samuel had been a master distillerone of the best in the region. The secret recipe he had inherited from his father was coveted by bootleggers and men who didn't care about the law. Samuel didn't just make whiskey, he made an experience, a taste that lingered long after the glass was empty, one that went down smooth but left a warmth in the belly that never seemed to fade. He was a legend, and now, with him gone, Eliza had inherited the business. But as she stood there in the dimly lit cabin, she realized she didn't just inherit his business. She had inherited a piece of his soul. The town had always been known for its moonshine passed down through generations of men and women who worked the land and made the liquor in secret. But there was something darker beneath the surface, something Eliza had never fully understood. Old stories passed through the lips of old women and whispered on the wind in the dead of night. Tales of lost souls, of spirits trapped in bottles, of people who had used moonshine for more than just drink but as a way to capture something beyond this world. Eliza couldn't push the thought out of her mind. Samuel had always believed in the power of whiskey, not just as a drink, but as something that tied people together. He always said there was more to it, something spiritual. That's why the recipe had never been written down, why it was passed down only in whispered words and secret glances. Eliza had never believed in that part of it. She had always chalked it up to superstition, but now, with Samuel gone, the thought wouldn't leave her. She needed something to hold on to. Her hands shook as she walked over to the shelves where Samuel's old books were kept, books on distilling, but also on folklore, on Southern customs. She had never paid them much mind before, but now she felt a strange pull toward them. She flipped through the pages of a worn leather-bound book, one Samuel had insisted she never read, a book filled with strange rituals and old sayings. As her eyes scanned the pages, she froze. There it was, a ritual so bizarre that it took a moment for her to comprehend what it meant. Distill the dead. The ritual promised to capture the essence of a loved one, to preserve their soul in the very liquor they had made in life. It was an ancient Southern tradition, something whispered about but never discussed openly. It was taboo, it was wrong, but it was exactly what she needed. The idea clung to her like a sickness. She could bring Samuel back, not as a person, not in the way she had known him, but as something Elsie's spirit, preserved forever in the whiskey they had made together. Maybe then, the silence wouldn't be so deafening. Maybe then, she wouldn't feel so alone. For days, Eliza struggled with the decision, but the grief, it overwhelmed her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Samuel's smile, his laughter, his hands on hers. It was as if he was still there, only just out of reach. She couldn't bear the thought of letting him go completely, and so, in the dead of night, she made the decision. She would perform the ritual. She would distill Samuel's body into whiskey, and his spirit would live forever. The process was intricate, dangerous, and utterly forbidden. She didn't care. She didn't care about the consequences anymore. The thought of losing him, of never hearing his voice again, was more terrifying than anything she could imagine. She set the stills up in the same spot where they had made their whiskey together, the tools Samuel had once used now in her hands. As she began the distillation process, she muttered the words from the book, barely believing what she was doing. The smell of burning wood filled the cabin, the crackling fire blending with the scent of Samuel's final moments. The process took hours, and with each passing minute, Eliza felt herself sinking deeper into the ritual, into the madness of it. The line between love and obsession blurred until there was nothing left but her desperate need to keep him close. As the liquid began to form, Eliza felt the weight of what she was doing. Was this madness? Was this wrong? It didn't matter anymore. By the time the sun rose, the ritual was complete. Samuel's essence was trapped inside the amber liquid, forever bound to the drink they had once shared. Eliza stood there, staring at the bottle in her hands, knowing that her life would never be the same. But what she didn't realize was that she wasn't just preserving Samuel. She was opening a door that could never be closed, and what lay on the other side was something darker than she could have ever imagined. But Eliza wasn't done yet. What she didn't know was that the whiskey wasn't just holding Samuel's spirit, it was changing him. And with every sip she took, she was drawing herself deeper into a nightmare that she couldn't escape. Eliza's decision to distill Samuel's body into whiskey wasn't one she arrived at lightly. The process itself was as steeped in history as it was in superstition. Samuel had been a master distiller, one of the most well-respected men in their corner of Tennessee. His whiskey was legendary smooth, potent, and made with such care that people would travel for miles just to taste it. What they didn't know was that Samuel had learned his craft from a long line of moonshiners who had secrets deeper than any recipe could explain. Eliza hadn't understood the full weight of his legacy when they were together. She had only seen the moonshine business as a way to make ends meet, an enterprise that fueled their modest but happy life. Samuel was the one who had taught her everything: how to select the best corn, how to manage the still, and, most importantly, how to care for the liquor. Every batch had to be just right, or else it wasn't worth drinking. But now, with Samuel gone, it wasn't just the distillery Eliza had inherited, it was his entire legacy, his entire world. The moonshine that had once flowed through their cabin now felt like a constant reminder of what she had lost. And in the depths of her grief, she found herself thinking about his old recipe book, the one Samuel had kept hidden, always a little too close to his chest. Samuel had been secretive about the family recipe, as though it were something sacred. "The recipe is more than just the ingredients, Eliza," he had said many times. "It's the craft, the love, the spirit of the land. You can't just bottle that." And yet, now that he was gone, Eliza felt as though she was the keeper of something sacred too. She had never been allowed to see the recipe, but she knew how to distill a good batch, even if it was never quite the same as Samuel's. The town had always been wary of moonshine. The illegal distilling was a constant dance with the law, and many families had paid the price for that lifestyle, some with their freedom, others with their lives. Samuel had walked that line carefully, always with one foot in the shadows. But it wasn't just the law he was afraid of. There were darker forces at play in the hills of Tennessee, old superstitions and fears that ran deeper than the law could reach. One of those superstitions, one Eliza had heard from the elders growing up, was the belief that whiskey wasn't just a drink. It was a spirit, a living thing, a creation that took on the energy of whoever made it. They believed that the moonshine could capture a piece of the maker's soul, especially if it was made with love and care. It was a belief Samuel never dismissed, but he never fully embraced it either. To him, it was just something people saw as a remnant of the old ways, something to entertain the superstitious old-timers with. But Eliza wasn't so sure anymore. As the days wore on, her mind became consumed with the idea that the whiskey was more than just a drink. She couldn't shake the feeling that it held something of Samuel. She had seen how people acted after. Drinking it, there was a warmth, a sense of connection. People spoke of feeling closer to him after a glass, as though Samuel's spirit had lingered, ever present in the liquor. She hadn't believed in these things before. But now, with her husband's body distilled into the same whiskey, she began to wonder. The first sip of the distilled whiskey was like nothing she had ever tasted. The richness of the flavor hit her immediately. Samuel's touch, his care, his love for the craft. And then, as the liquid slid down her throat, she felt something else. A warmth, yes, but also a strange familiarity. It was as though she could feel Samuel beside her again, his presence lingering in the air, close enough to touch. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe that Samuel had returned to her. She sat alone in their cabin, staring at the fire, cradling the bottle in her hands. It was as if he had never left. The whiskey was like a bridge between the living and the dead, and for Eliza, it felt like a lifeline. But soon, the feeling began to shift. Eliza began drinking more often, unable to resist the pull of the whiskey. Each drink made her feel closer to Samuel until, one day, she noticed something was wrong. The warmth she felt when she first drank it was turning into something different. It wasn't comforting anymore. It was consuming. She found herself drinking for longer periods, not just for the connection to Samuel, but to escape the crushing loneliness. She couldn't stop herself. The whiskey had a way of taking her attention, her time, and her sanity. The line between the living and the dead blurred the more she drank. Samuel's voice came to her at night, not in the soft whispers Shed once heard, but with a harshness, an urgency. His presence grew stronger, but it wasn't just Samuel anymore. It was something else. One night, Eliza woke to the sound of footsteps outside the cabin. She stood, trembling, and peered through the window. There was no one there, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, and then, in the quiet of the cabin, she heard a voice deep, familiar, yet distorted. "Eliza, you've made a terrible mistake." Her heart raced, and she staggered back, knocking over a jar of moonshine. The voice was unmistakably Samuel's, but it didn't sound like him. It was distorted, twisted with anger, as if the spirit that had once been his had changed. The next day, she ventured into town to get fresh supplies. People avoided her, their eyes avoiding hers as she walked down the street. She could feel the weight of their whisperish reputation was spreading, and it wasn't the one they'd known her by. Something had shifted in her, and they could see it. Her eyes were wild, her hands shaking, her steps uneven. They didn't understand, but Eliza knew what she had done. She had brought Samuel back, but not in the way she imagined. She hadn't just trapped his spirit in the whiskey. She had opened a doorway that let something else in. That night, she sat by the still, the bottle of distilled whiskey sitting before her like a tempting, dangerous thing. Her hand hovered over the bottle as she hesitated. The warmth, the comfort, it was all slipping away. Was she still drinking to keep Samuel close, or was it something else now? Something darker, more sinister? Her mind screamed for her to stop, but her hand reached for the bottle. The hunger inside her was too strong. As the whiskey poured into her glass, she heard it again, the voice, distorted and angry, more urgent now. "You've made a terrible mistake, Eliza." She took the glass in her trembling hands and drank. And as the liquid slid down her throat, she felt Ida's presence in the room, suffocating and cold. Samuel's spirit was no longer just a memory. It was something else, something darker, and something very real. The whiskey was no longer just a tribute to his memory, it was a prison, and Eliza had trapped them both inside. But Eliza's worst fears were just beginning to come true. Samuel's spirit wasn't just haunting her, it was taking over. And now, the town was starting to notice the change in her, and they didn't know how much longer they could ignore the curse she had unleashed. The real horror was only beginning. Eliza's world began to unravel the moment she took that last sip of whiskey. At first, it felt like a blessing, a moment of connection, like Samuel was sitting right beside her, laughing at some inside joke only the two of them shared. But as the days passed, that sense of closeness faded, replaced by a cold, unsettling sensation. It was as if Samuel was there, but not really there. Something was wrong. She had no one to turn to. The town, already whispering about her odd behavior, now avoided her entirely. The old women who once offered comforting advice now crossed the street when they saw her coming. The preacher, who had always given her a gentle nod in passing, now kept his distance, muttering prayers under his breath when he thought she wasn't looking. No one understood the pain she was in, the endless hunger to have Samuel back in any form, alive or otherwise. The whiskey, which had started as her salvation, had turned into an insidious, powerful force, gnawing at her from the inside. Then came the book. Samuel's old journal sat untouched on the shelf, a weathered, leather-bound relic of a time long past. She had seen it many times, but had never dared to open it. It was his private thing, something he had kept close, always hidden from her prying eyes. But now, desperation clawed at her, and she felt an undeniable pull to it. There was something inside, it's something she was missing, some answer to the chaos that had descended upon her. The book was thick, its pages yellowed with age, its edges frayed and worn. It looked as though it had been passed down through generations, its spine cracked from years of use. As she flipped through it, a strange chill settled over her. There were recipes, yes, but not just for whiskey. They were strange. Incantations, rituals, and warnings of the price one must pay for tampering with forces beyond this world. And as she read the words, a cold, terrifying realization dawned on her. Samuel had known more than he let on. The book was filled with references to old Appalachian folklore tales of spirits trapped in the liquor they created, legends passed down by those who had once walked the hills and forests, people who had dabbled in the darker side of life. And there it was, buried among the passages about distilling, the ritual of the dead, a forbidden practice, said to bring a loved one back from death by capturing their spirit in a bottle of moonshine. But it wasn't just about the spirit, it was about something much darker. A soul bound by fire and liquid never truly rests, the book warned. What is trapped must be freed at a cost no one should bear. Eliza's heart pounded as she read the words. She had done this, she had trapped Samuel's spirit, and in doing so, she had crossed a line that should never have been crossed. The book didn't offer any answers, only cryptic warnings about the consequences of tampering with the dead. It spoke of the price of such a ritual, price being that not only the spirit of the deceased would be bound to the liquor, but the very essence of their soul would remain there forever. For the first time since Samuel's death, Eliza was afraid. She had thought she was merely keeping him close, but now she understood the truth. Samuel wasn't just lingering. Near Harry was trapped in the whiskey, his soul bound to it. But it wasn't just Samuel's soul that was captured. The ritual had been incomplete, and something else had gotten inside, something darker, something that had shifted Samuel's essence. The book spoke of a time when the whiskey would begin to thirst, calling for more than just the original spirit, feeding on the energy of the living, growing stronger with each passing day. It was then that Eliza understood. The whiskey was no longer Samuel's, it had become something else, and it wanted to be free. The more she read, the more Eliza realized the danger she was in. She hadn't just brought Samuel back, she had opened a gateway, inviting something far more sinister into her life. It was no longer just about keeping him close. The whiskey was a curse, a living force that would grow stronger and more destructive with time. She had unknowingly made herself its prison, trapped in a cycle of consumption she couldn't escape. That night, she took a drink from the bottle again, hoping for comfort, hoping to feel Samuel's presence once more. But what she felt this time was different. The warmth of the whiskey was gone, replaced by a chill that ran through her veins. The voice she had once heard soft, loving was now a growl, a distorted mockery of Samuel's. Eliza had whispered, but it was not him. It was something else, something much darker. You've opened the door, and now you must pay the price. The words rattled in her mind like thunder. She threw the bottle across the room, but the voice wouldn't stop. It echoed in her ears, in her thoughts, in her very bones. She had made a terrible mistake, but she didn't know how to undo it. The town was beginning to talk more, and more people had seen her wandering the streets, her eyes vacant, her speech slurred. They could see something had changed in her. Her spirit was gone, consumed by the very thing she had tried to keep close. They didn't understand, but they knew something had to be done. The preacher, finally realizing the true horror of what was happening, came to her cabin one evening. He knocked on the door, and when Eliza didn't answer, he entered anyway. "Eliza," he said softly, seeing her sitting alone in the dim light, clutching the whiskey bottle. "You need to stop. This curse, it's too much. You're not just grieving anymore. You're losing yourself." But Eliza didn't hear him. She couldn't. The voice of the spirit had drowned out everything. The whiskey was calling to her, urging her to drink more, to free it. The preacher's presence made the air thick, suffocating. He stepped closer, but as his hand reached out toward her, he recoiled. The room grew colder, darker, and the shadows in the corners of the cabin began to move. Something in the air shifted, and Eliza's eyes snapped to his with a wild intensity. "Get out," she rasped, her voice hoarse, unlike anything he had ever heard from her before. "You don't understand. Hez here. Hez with me." But it wasn't Samuel anymore. Not in the way she had hoped. And it wasn't just the whiskey that had trapped him. Eliza had opened a door to something else, something far darker than she could have ever imagined. The preacher backed away slowly, fear creeping up his spine. He knew now that Eliza was lost. The curse was spreading not just in her mind, but through the land. There would be no stopping it now. But Eliza wasn't the only one suffering. The spirit she had trapped in the whiskey was growing stronger, feeding off her obsession and madness. and the town would soon learn that Eliza's nightmare wasn't contained to her cabinet, was about to spread to them all. The town of Tennessee had always been a place where old traditions and superstitions hung heavy in the air like the smell of fresh moonshine. For generations, the people had lived by certain rules, never questioning the things that had been passed down, and always respecting the unspoken boundaries of what could and couldn't be done. But Eliza had crossed that line. She had opened a door that could never be closed, and now the town would pay the price. Eliza had become a ghost in her own life. Her eyes were hollow, her movements slow and deliberate. The woman who once walked the streets with purpose, a smile on her lips, had vanished. In her place was a woman consumed by something darker, something that no one could understand. She could no longer feel the warmth of Samuel's memory. All she felt was the pull of the whiskey, that terrible, cursed liquid that had become both her salvation and her damnation. The bottle she had crafted was sitting on the table before her, an object that seemed both inviting and terrifying at the same time. It shimmered in the dim light, its golden hue like the glow of a fading sunset. Every time Eliza looked at it, she felt a surge of longing. It was as though Samuel's very spirit was trapped inside, crying out to be set free. But there was something else in that bottle, something dark, something hungry, and she had fed it every drop, every sip. She had sealed her fate the moment she had started. But Eliza wasn't just drinking to numb the pain anymore. She had realized with a horrifying clarity that the whiskey had become more than just a connection. To Samuel, it had become a trap, a prison. For her, for him, and for everyone around her. One night, as the moon hung low in the sky, casting a silvery glow through the cracked windows of the cabin, Eliza's obsession reached a breaking point. She could feel Samuel's presence in the air, suffocating her, but his voice had changed. It wasn't the warm, comforting presence it once was. It was demanding, full of anger and bitterness. "Eliza," the voice growled, "you've taken too much. You've trapped me in this place, in this liquid. You must set me free." Her hands shook as she held the bottle, staring at it like it was an extension of her own soul. Samuel's spirit was no longer just a whisper in the night. He had become something darker, something other. And Eliza realized, too late, that what she had thought was a ritual of love had become something far more dangerous. The whiskey was calling to her, urging her to drink, to keep feeding it, but she had no choice but to listen to the voice now. The bottle had begun to pulse in her hands, and the room around her seemed to bend and stretch, the shadows moving like living things. Samuel was speaking through the whiskey, but it wasn't Samuel anymore. It was something else. "You've opened the door, Eliza." The words hung in the air, and Eliza felt her heart race in her chest. She staggered backward, knocking over a chair, but the voice continued, a growl that vibrated through her very bones. "You will never be free. You have made a terrible mistake, and now you will pay." Eliza tried to steady herself, but her legs gave way beneath her. The cabin swirled around her, and she felt as though she were falling into an abyss. Desperation clawed at her chest, suffocating her. She had to stop. She had to undo it. But how? Her eyes darted around the cabin, landing on the book, the same one she had found earlier, the one that had shown her the ritual she had performed. The words were still fresh in her mind, and the warning burned through her thoughts like a branding iron. Once the spirit is trapped, it is never truly freed, and what is freed will come for you. She had thought she could control it, but she was wrong. "Eliza," the voice now came from the bottle itself. "You have no power over me. You never did." Suddenly the room went cold. The wind howled through the cracks in the walls, and the floorboards creaked as though something was moving beneath them. Eliza's hands shot up to her ears, trying to block out the voice, but it was inside her head, filling every crevice of her mind. And then, in the corner of the room, she saw him. At first, she thought it was a trick of the lightest shadow in the darkness, but then his figure became clearer. It was Samuel, or what was left of him. His face was contorted, his eyes wide and hollow. His body was pale, his features sharp and twisted, as though the spirit that had once been him had been ripped apart and shoved back into the world of the living. "Eliza," he whispered, though it was no longer his voice. "You brought me back, but this is not what I was. This is not what you wanted." The room seemed to spin around her as the figure of Samuel advanced. His body moved like a marionette on strings, jerky and unnatural. But his eyes were still filled with that familiar warmth, the warmth that Eliza had craved since the day he died. "I never wanted to be brought back," the twisted version of Samuel continued, his voice now deep and unsettling. "But you've opened the floodgates. You've unleashed something far darker than you can handle. Eliza stepped backward, heart pounding in her chest, but the figure moved closer, its presence suffocating. She tried to scream, but no sound came from her throat. She was trapped between the man she had loved and the demon that now stood in his place. "You must finish what you started," Samuel's voice growled. "You have to release me or we both die." The words echoed in her mind, but Eliza didn't know what he meant. How could she release him when she had already trapped him? How could she fix the damage she had caused? The room was closing in on her. The walls were pressing inward, the shadows of Samuel's distorted form stretching long across the floor. She couldn't breathe, she couldn't think, and in that moment she realized what had to be done. The ritual wasn't just a way to bring Samuel back, it was a way to release him. The book had been clear, but what the book didn't say, what it never mentioned, was the price of that release. Eliza had to make a choice: finish the ritual and set him free, or allow the curse to consume them both. Her hands trembled as she reached for the bottle, but as soon as her fingers touched the glass, Samuel's voice had screamed inside her head. "Do it, Eliza. Finish it." And so, with a heart full of terror and regret, she took the bottle in her hands and brought it to her lips. She knew there was no going back. As the liquid poured into her mouth, Eliza felt the room explode with energy. The shadows in the corners twisted and writhed. Samuel's twisted form howled in agony, his eyes turning black as night. The air crackled with energy, with power, with death. And then, as the final drop left the bottle, everything went silent. The room fell into stillness, and the darkness receded. Eliza dropped to her knees, gasping for breath. But as the silence grew, Eliza felt something shift. The curse hadn't gone. It had changed. Samuel's spirit was gone, but something far darker had replaced him, and it was waiting. But the worst was yet to come. Eliza had completed the ritual, but the price was more than she could ever have imagined. The curse she had unleashed had only just begun to feed, and it wasn't finished with her yet. Eliza staggered back from the bottle, her hands shaking, her heart hammering in her chest. The air around her had become suffocating, as if the very walls of the cabin were closing in on her. She felt a cold sweat break out over her skin, and the silence that followed the last drop of whiskey felt like the calm before the storm. The room was still, but something had changed. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper now, more alive, and she could feel them watching her. The figure of Samuel twisted, contorted, was gone. But there was something else in the room, something that wasn't there before. Eliza's mind raced. What had she done? Had she really freed him, or had she just unleashed something far worse? Her breath came in shallow gasps, and she glanced around the room, her eyes searching for the source of the unease gnawing at her insides. The air was thick with tension, but it wasn't just the lingering traces of Samuel's spirit, it was something else, something far more sinister. Suddenly, the fire in the hearth flared up, casting flickering shadows across the room. Eliza froze, her eyes locked on the flames as they danced and twisted in unnatural patterns. And then, she heard Ida low, guttural growl. It wasn't Samuel's voice. It wasn't even human. The sound seemed to vibrate through her bones, filling the room with a dark, malevolent presence. "Eliza," the voice whispered, but it wasn't just one voice. It was a chorus, dozens, hundreds of voices, all speaking at once, all pleading, screaming. "You've made a mistake, Eliza. You've opened it." Her head spun. She couldn't make sense of the words. "Opened what?" she whispered to herself, her voice shaking. The growls grew louder, more frantic. The flames in the hearth danced violently, and Eliza could see the shapes moving in the smoke figures, distorted and twisted, like shadows of lost souls. The room began to feel colder, the air heavier, as though the very walls were pressing in on her. No, she thought, this isn't right. Her heart raced, panic setting in as she realized the truth. The ritual hadn't just released Samuel. It had unleashed something else, something trapped in the whiskey, something older, more dangerous than anything she could have imagined. Eliza stumbled to the door, but the cabin seemed to shift around her. The walls were no longer solid, they were moving, warping like some grotesque dream. Her hands gripped the doorframe, but it wouldn't open. She tried again, pulling with all her strength, but the door was stuck, as if the house itself had locked her in. Her breath came faster, panic setting in. What was happening? Was this the curse? Had the whiskey become a prison, trapping her in its evil hold? The voice of Samuel's voice among them began to chant in a language she didn't understand, their words vibrating through the cabin like a storm. The noise grew louder, the shadows stretching closer, until they seemed to consume the room entirely. And then, as if a switch had been flipped, the chanting stopped. Silence filled the cabin once again, an oppressive, suffocating silence. Eliza's pulse pounded in her ears. She was shaking, her body soaked in sweat, her mind reeling. The fire in the hearth flickered out, leaving only the pale light of the moon to illuminate the cabin. Eliza stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Every instinct told her to run, to flee from the nightmare she had created, but the shadows in the corners seemed to shift with malicious intent. The voices began again, but this time, they weren't speaking at all. The shadows were moving, slithering toward her, their shapes distorting, contorting in unnatural ways. Eliza's heart raced as the shapes took form, forming into dark, twisted figures that surrounded her, closing in from every angle. She tried to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. The figures were growing closer, their features too dark to discern. Their eyes glowed with a malevolent, otherworldly light. The air around her felt thick, suffocating. She could feel them closing in, pressing against her, filling her senses with an overwhelming sense of dread. Then the figure in the center, the largest one, stepped forward. It wasn't Samuel. It wasn't even human. The figure was tall, with limbs too long and a face that was a twisted mockery of a human's. Its eyes were glowing orbs, and its mouth stretched wide into a smile that seemed to be made of nothing but teeth. Eliza, the voice rasped, but it was no longer the voice of Samuel. It was the voice of something ancient, something that had been locked away for centuries. "You freed us all, Eliza." Her body trembled, unable to escape, as the figure's mouth opened wider, revealing a gaping abyss inside. The figure's presence was overwhelming, more than any human being could withstand. She could feel herself being pulled in, her body unable to resist the crushing weight of its presence. "No," she cried out, her voice hoarse. "I didn't mean to, I didn't know." The figure tilted its head, as if considering her words. "Ignorance is no excuse, Eliza. You've opened the gates, and now you must pay the price." A cold wind swept through the cabin, extinguishing the candlelight and throwing the room into darkness. Eliza's body was frozen, her mind racing for a way out, but every thought was drowned by the weight of the creature's gaze. "Eliza," the creature's voice was deep, resonating inside her skull. "You are the key, and now you will be the one to unlock us all." The room seemed to collapse inward. Eliza could feel herself slipping, her knees buckling beneath her as she crumpled to the ground. Desperation clawed at her throat, but it was no use. There was no escape, no way out. And just as she thought she would lose herself completely, a crackling sound filled the air, a sharp, sudden noise like breaking glass. The walls around her shattered, and light flooded the room. For a moment, she thought she saw a figure standing in the doorway, someone familiar, someone she thought was lost forever. It was Samuel, or what was left of him. He reached for her, his hand outstretched, and for a brief moment, Eliza thought she could feel his warmth again. But as she took his hand, the ground beneath her gave way, and the room collapsed into nothingness. But the nightmare wasn't over. Eliza had thought she was being saved, but in the end, it wasn't Samuel who had come to help her. It was something far worse, and now the true cost of her actions was about to be paid in full. The darkness had only just begun to spread. The once sleepy town of Tennessee was no longer a place of peace. The events surrounding Eliza's sudden shift in behavior had left the town in a state of unease. People no longer stopped by her cabin to offer condolences. The whispers behind her back had turned into open conversation. In the town square, people gathered, speaking in hushed tones about what had become of Eliza and her strange behavior. The preacher was the first to speak out, his voice full of fear and conviction. "Eliza is lost," he said, his face pale. "There's something wrong with her, and we're all in danger." He had seen it firsthand, the strange, hollow look in her eyes, the desperate mutterings as if she were speaking to someone or something only she could see. The townsfolk were worried, but no one dared confront her directly. What if she had truly become possessed? What if the curse she had unleashed was spreading through the town, infecting everyone who came into contact with her? The rumors were growing worse. People spoke of strange lights seen flickering in her cabin windows at night, shadows moving in ways that didn't seem natural. One man claimed to have heard a woman crying out from the cabin, but when he went to check, the place was silent. When another woman wandered too close, she swore she heard a voice calling her Namia, voice that wasn't Eliza's but sounded familiar. But despite all the strange happenings, no one had gone to see Eliza. No one had dared to knock on her door, unsure of what they might find on the other side. It wasn't just the town's suspicions about Eliza's mental state, it was the growing dread that something much darker had taken root in the land. Eliza's grief, her actions, had unleashed something unnatural, and no one knew what would happen next. As days passed, more and more people in town began to feel the effects of the curse. It wasn't immediate, but there something shifting in the air, something in the soil that felt wrong. Crops began to wither in the fields, sickly and blackened by some unseen force. Animals died in their pens, their bodies stiff and lifeless, as if the very life had been drained from them. And worst of all, there was a sense of unease that hung over the town like a cloud. The town's mayor, a practical man who had always been rooted in reason, finally decided to take action. He couldn't ignore the rumors anymore. Something had to be done about Eliza before the curse consumed them all. So he called a meeting, gathering the town's leaders to discuss what to do. At the meeting, the mayor stood at the front of the room, his face grim. "We all know what's been happening," he said, his voice low, "but what we don't know is how to stop it. The preacher says Eliza's gone mad, and people have seen strange things around her cabin. We've lost animals, crops, even children have been sick. I don't know if it's some kind of sickness or if it's something else, but I think it's time we went to Eliza and tried to bring her back to her senses." The townspeople murmured amongst themselves, fear and doubt written on their faces. One man, an old farmer who had known Eliza since she was a child, spoke up. "I don't know. Something's not right about her, not since the day Samuel died. It's like Shez, not herself. I saw her once, standing by the still, just staring at the smoke, like she wasn't there, and I heard her talking, but not to mesh she was talking to someone else. I don't know who, but it wasn't just her." The mayor nodded grimly. "That's why we have to go. If we let this go on any longer, who knows what will happen to this town. We need to see if Eliza is still Eliza, and if not, we'll have to take other measures." The group agreed, and the decision was made. The mayor, accompanied by the preacher and a few other brave souls, would go to Eliza's cabin the next morning and confront her. There was no telling what they would find. The next morning, the group set out, their steps heavy with both fear and determination. As they walked through the woods toward her cabin, the trees seemed to close in on them, their branches twisting in the wind, casting long shadows across the path. There was something unnatural about the silence of the woods, something heavy in the air, like the earth itself was holding its breath. When they finally reached Eliza's cabin, the door was ajar, creaking in the wind. The air around the cabin was thick, suffused with an ominous energy that made their skin crawl. The mayor pushed the door open, and the group stepped inside. Eliza was sitting in the middle of the room, her back to them. Her head was tilted to the side, her hands resting in her lap. She was staring at the bottle of whiskey on the table in front of her, a strange smile playing at the corners of her lips. Her eyes were glassy, distant and hollow, like they no longer saw the world around her. "Eliza?" the preacher called softly, stepping toward her. "Eliza, it's us. We're here to help." At the sound of his voice, Eliza's head jerked toward them, her eyes snapping open. But the look in them was nothing, like the Eliza they once knew. It was empty, as if the soul that had once inhabited her was no longer in control. The smile on her lips spread wider, stretching unnaturally, like it was forced onto her face. "You shouldn't have come," Eliza whispered, her voice low and strange. "You can't stop it. None of you can." The preacher stepped back, fear creeping into his eyes. "Eliza, what's happened to you?" he asked, his voice shaking. Eliza's gaze hardened, her expression twisted into something dark, something that didn't belong. "You were warned," she said. "The curse is already here, and now you're all part of it." Before anyone could react, the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift, stretching like living things. The temperature dropped, and a cold wind whipped through the cabin, making the candles flicker. The shadows began to move faster, swarming toward them with unnatural speed. "It's too late," Eliza said, her voice now an eerie chant. "The curse has already claimed us all." And then, something horrifying happened. The shadows moved, they twisted into shapes, figures, monstrous and dark, their eyes glowing like embers. The group froze in terror as the shadows solidified, forming into grotesque figures, each one resembling a twisted version of someone they had once known. Figures that had once walked the streets of the town, figures that had disappeared long ago. The townspeople backed toward the door, but the shadow figures advanced, their eyes glowing with malice. The mayor reached for the door, but it slammed shut with a deafening crash. "You can't leave," Eliza whispered, her voice now a hiss. "You've opened the door with me, and now you belong to it." The shadows surged toward them, and the last thing the preacher saw before the darkness consumed them was Eliza's twisted smile, her eyes gleaming with a strange satisfaction. The town, once filled with life and promise, had now become a place of darkness. Eliza had crossed the line, and the curse had begun to consume them all. But there was more to come, more danger, more darkness waiting just around the corner, and it would take more than a few brave souls to stop the nightmare Eliza had unleashed. Eliza's once quiet life had now been reduced to a nightmare, a dark spiral she couldn't escape. The town had fallen into chaos, consumed by the curse she had unleashed, and she was beyond saving. She could feel the madness creeping through her veins, spreading like wildfire. The whiskey, that wretched elixir, had consumed her thoughts, her soul, her very essence. She wandered the cabin aimlessly, her hands trembling as they brushed against the walls, her mind a fog of confusion and terror. Samuel's spirit was gone, she knew that. But something else had taken its place, something darker. The air felt heavy, thick with the presence of Them's spirits, the shadows that had followed her every step since she had first made the whiskey. And now it was clear they were no longer just lingering, they were demanding her soul. Her breath quickened as she stumbled toward the window, gazing out at the overgrown woods beyond the cabin. The once beautiful land now looked like a prison, a dark, oppressive place where shadows twisted like serpents in the trees. She couldn't remember the last time she had left her cabin. Couldn't remember the last time she had seen a friendly face. The town, gone. The people, they had either fled or fallen victim to whatever curse she had brought upon them. Eliza's grip tightened on the windowsill. "What have I done?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her question went unanswered, the wind howling in her ears. She turned away from the window and stumbled back toward the table, her eyes landing once again on the bottle. It sat there, mocking her, like an old friend who had betrayed her. She was no longer sure if it had been her who had called out to the whiskey, or if it had called to her. All she knew was that it was too late now. She had done it. She had crossed the line, and there was no going back. The voice came again, Samuel's voice, though it sounded twisted and hollow. "You can't undo it, Eliza. It has taken root in you." Eliza's heart thudded in her chest. "No," she said, shaking her head, trying to block the voice out. "No, I didn't mean for this to happen. I just wanted you back." The voice laughed, but it wasn't a laugh of comfort. It was cruel, filled with malice. "I am not Samuel anymore." Eliza fell to her knees, the weight of the realization crushing. What are you?" The shadows in the room shifted, twisting and coiling around her like smoke. And then, through the darkness, something emerged, a figure, tall and twisted with hollow eyes that glowed with a sickly yellow light. It wasn't Samuel. It wasn't even a man. It was something other, something that had been trapped in the whiskey, something that had been waiting. "Eliza," the thing hissed, its voice a deep, unnatural growl. "You've set me free, and now you belong to me." She recoiled, her breath coming in sharp gasps. She couldn't move, couldn't run. The thing was everywhere, closing in around her, filling the room with its suffocating presence. "No," Eliza whimpered, her voice breaking. "Please, no." But it was too late. The darkness had already taken root in her. She had invited it in when she had made that first drink, when she had allowed the ritual to unfold. She had never understood the true cost of the curse, the price of keeping a soul trapped inside whiskey. It was more than just a simple resurrection. It was an invitation to something far darker. The figure loomed over her, its glowing eyes staring down at her with twisted amusement. "You thought you could control me, but you were wrong. You've unleashed a force that you can't contain. We are free now, and you are our vessel." Eliza's mind screamed in protest, but the figure's presence was overwhelming. Her thoughts were muddled, her body frozen in place. She had done it. She had freed whatever had been trapped in the whiskey, and now it was taking her too. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift. The room spun, and Eliza's vision blurred. She gasped for air, clutching at her throat, but it felt as though the air itself was being drained from the room. The darkness enveloped her completely. She was no longer in control of her body, no longer in control of anything. The thing that had once been Samuel or whatever it was had taken over, and she had no way of stopping it. But then, through the haze of darkness, a light flickered. It was faint, like a candle in the wind. Eliza's vision cleared for just a moment, and she saw a figure standing in the doorway, a person she knew. Her heart skipped a beat. "Samuel?" she whispered, but the figure didn't move. It stood there watching her. "Eliza," the figure said softly, "you have to fight this. You have to fight me." Eliza's eyes widened. It was him. It was really him. But just as she reached out to him, the darkness surged, blocking him from her sight. She screamed, desperate to reach him, to make sense of what was happening. The figure, now fully engulfed by the shadows, was gone. "Eliza," the voice echoed again, its tone mocking. "You've lost everything." Her knees buckled beneath her, and she fell to the ground, the weight of the curse settling over her like a shroud. The last shred of hope she had clung to had vanished. What was once a beautiful memory of love and grief had twisted into something monstrous. She had wanted to bring Samuel back, but in doing so, she had invited this curse that had consumed not only her, but the town itself. And as the shadows closed in, Eliza realized with a horrifying clarity that she was no longer Eliza. She was the vessel, the doorway through which the darkness would spread. The curse was no longer just in her cabin, it was in the land itself, and it would never leave. But even as the shadows consumed her, Eliza knew there was one last chance to make things right. The curse had its grip on her, but perhaps, just perhaps, there was still one way to stop it. And if she was strong enough to face it, she might just have a chance to save the town from the nightmare she had created. But the clock was ticking, and there was no time left to waste. Eliza stood in the center of the cabin, her body trembling, her mind a blur of confusion and terror. The shadows had closed in on her, and now she was one of them, a vessel for the darkness that had been unleashed. What had once been a small personal grief had become a nightmare beyond her control. The cabin no longer felt like her home, it felt like a prison. The spirits toes who had been trapped in the whiskey, and those who had entered with a terror not just haunting her now. They were feeding on her fear, on her pain, on the very essence of her soul. Each breath she took seemed to draw them closer, their whispers filling the air with a suffocating dread. As the figures swirled around her, she tried to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. The darkness pressed in from all sides, and she felt herself being pulled deeper into its grip, her body no longer hers to control. "You've unleashed us," a voice crooned from the depths of the shadowy figures. It was familiar and yet terrifyingly wrong. It was Samuel's voice, or what was left of it, and now we will never leave. Eliza's heart pounded in her chest. She had wanted Samuel back, she had wanted him so badly. But now, the very thing she had loved was gone, replaced by something monstrous, something ancient and evil. The curse was spreading, not just within her but throughout the entire town. Her thoughts flashed back to the moments before she had distilled his body, before she had thought this was a way to bring him back. She had been blinded by grief, unable to see the truth. She had crossed a line that no one should ever cross. And now, it was too late. The shadows seemed to multiply before her eyes, twisting into shapes that made no sense, flickering and shifting in the low light. They whispered her name, their voices a low, guttural hum that vibrated through her skull. Eliza, the voice, was softer now, as if it were directly inside her mind. She could feel it pressing against her thoughts, demanding attention. "You did this. You set us free, but you cannot control us." The weight of the realization hit her like a ton of bricks. The spirits had been trapped for too long, bound by the ritual she had performed. They had wanted to be free, and now they were loose. There was no going back from this. The curse would spread to the rest of the town, consuming everything in its path. Her own soul was being torn apart, piece by piece, by the very spirits she had tried to bring back. Suddenly, there was a loud crash at the door. Eliza spun around, her heart racing. The cabin was filled with an oppressive darkness, and she was losing herself. Was it the town? Had they finally come to put an end to the curse she had unleashed? But it wasn't the town. It wasn't a person at all. The door exploded inward, and in its place stood a figure tall, shadowy, and unmistakably familiar. Samuel, or rather, what was left of him. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. The figure before her was no longer the man she had known, the man she had loved. He was an empty shell, a twisted mockery of the person he once was. His eyes, once full of warmth, were now dark voids, his skin pale and stretched tight across his bones. His body was contorted and broken, like a puppet whose strings had been pulled too tight. "Eliza," Samuel's voice rasped, but it was wrong twisted. "You think you can undo what you've done? You think you can stop it?" Eliza took a step back, her hands shaking. She couldn't speak. She could barely breathe. What are you?" she whispered, her voice a broken rasp. "I am what you made me," Samuel replied, his voice cold and hollow. "You couldn't bring me back, Eliza. You released all of us. You opened the door, and now there's no turning back." A dark laugh echoed through the cabin, and Eliza's heart sank. The room seemed to stretch and distort, as if the very fabric of reality was bending under the weight of the curse. The shadows that had once been distant, eerie whispers were now alive, swirling around her, clinging to her skin, suffocating her with their presence. "No," Eliza gasped, the weight of her own words crashing down on her. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I just wanted to be with you again. I didn't know, but now you know." Samuel's distorted voice interrupted, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Now you understand the price." The shadows around them began to pulse, growing larger, more tangible. The very ground beneath Eliza's feet began to crack, fissures opening in the floorboards as if the cabin itself were breaking apart. And then, through the overwhelming darkness, Eliza saw a faint flicker of light, the glow of the moon through the shattered window. It was the only thing that hadn't changed, the only thing that seemed to still be untouched by the curse. In a moment of clarity, Eliza understood. The light wasn't just a source of illumination, it was a way out. It was a symbol of what she had to do. She had to stop the curse. She had to close the door she had opened. But as the shadows closed in, she knew she couldn't do it alone. With every ounce of strength she had left, Eliza reached out toward the light, the last shred of hope that hadn't been consumed by darkness. And just before the shadows swallowed her, "Whole," she whispered the only thing she could. "Help me." But even as Eliza reached for salvation, she knew the fight was far from over. The curse had only just begun to spread, and the darkness was more powerful than she had ever imagined. Now, with the town on the brink of destruction, Eliza must make a choice: face the spirit she freed, or let the town burn under the weight of the curse she had unleashed. Eliza's heart pounded as she reached toward the light. Her fingers trembled, barely brushing the glow of the moonlight that streamed through the shattered window. It was her last hope, the one thing that seemed untouched by the darkness that had overtaken her. But as she extended her hand, a surge of energy gripped her body, and she was pulled back, away from the light, into the suffocating shadows that had once been Samuel's spirit. "You think you can escape?" Samuel's voice came from everywhere at once, low and mocking, a distorted echo in her mind. The cabin seemed to shake with the force of it. "You've opened the door, Eliza. There's no going back. We are free, and you are our prisoner." The figure of Samuel, if it could even be called that anymore, loomed in the center of the room, its form shifting and changing, like smoke swirling in the dark. Eliza's knees buckled beneath her as the weight of his words hit her. She had tried to do the impossible. She had tried to bring him back, and now, in doing so, she had condemned herself, and perhaps the entire town, to a fate far worse than death. The shadows stretched across the room, crawling toward her, their cold tendrils wrapping around her arms and legs. Eliza struggled to break free, but the darkness was too strong, its grip tightening with every move she made. She could feel it pressing against her chest, squeezing out every bit of air, every last ounce of strength. She was losing herself, losing everything she had fought for. But in that moment of despair, something changed. A whisper in her mind, a memory, a vision of Samuel, the man she had loved before everything had gone so horribly wrong. Eliza's voice was faint, fragile, but it was unmistakable. The warmth she had felt from him, the love, the life they had shared, it was all still there, buried deep beneath the curse, beneath the darkness. She clung to it, grasped at it like a lifeline. This wasn't him, this wasn't Samuel anymore. But there was still a chance, still a way to stop it. "Eliza, don't give up." The voice broke through the shadows, cutting through the layers of darkness that surrounded her. The cold tendrils loosened just slightly. She drew in a sharp breath, feeling the faintest trace of freedom. Her mind cleared. Her body, though still bound by the curse, seemed to spark with renewed energy. She had one chance to stop the nightmare. The moonlight was still there, faint but unyielding, and with it, a single thought struck her: the light. The thing that had been a symbol of hope was the very thing that could destroy. The curse. She could use it, but she couldn't do it alone. "Eliza," the voice called again, a little louder now. It was Samuel's voice, but it was softer, gentler than it had been before. "You have to let go of me. Let me go. Let us both go." Eliza's vision blurred, but she didn't hesitate. With what little strength she had left, she reached into the darkness and grabbed hold of the light. The room exploded with sound, the shadows howling as they began to dissipate. The figure of Samuel, the thing that had once been Samuel, screeched in fury as the light grew brighter, pushing against the darkness, forcing it back. "I won't let you take me," Eliza screamed, her voice raw. "I won't let you take him any longer." The light grew brighter, flooding the room, burning away the shadows, tearing at the curse that had clung to her. And in that instant, the room was filled with a blinding flash. The shadows recoiled, and the cabin seemed to sigh with relief. When the light finally dimmed, Eliza was alone. The shadows were gone. The oppressive weight had lifted from the room, leaving only the faint glow of the moon to fill the space. Eliza collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. The air was clear, free from the oppressive force that had haunted her for so long. She had done it. She had stopped it. But she knew the battle wasn't over. The curse had been broken, but its scars remained. The town was safer now, but the question that lingered, the question that haunted her as she lay there on the floor, was whether she could ever truly be free of what she had unleashed. Had she saved Samuel's soul, or had she just delayed the inevitable? Final payoff, the town slowly began to rebuild, its people returning from the edges of panic and fear. Eliza, though still haunted by the shadows of what she had done, found herself freed from the curse. For now she was at peace, but peace, she knew, was fragile. The spirits she had freed would never truly leave her mind, and the darkness she had invited into the world was not something easily forgotten. The only thing she could do was live with the knowledge that some doors, once opened, could never be closed. But as long as the moonlight shone, and as long as the town remained untouched by the curse, Eliza would keep fighting, because she knew, deep down, that the battle for the soul of Tennessee wasn't over. It had only just begun.